I would like to talk to you about one thing tonight that I think matters so much, something that all of us need, but a lot of us find in short supply. Hope. What does that word do for you? Think about it for a minute. Hope. What do you think? What do you feel? If you're anything like me, when you hear the word hope, something happens within you. Something happens with your heart where you feel a stirring. Something in you knows hope is something that your heart is thirsty for. You know, in a world that's filled with terrorists and suicide bombers, and in a country where mass shootings are really seeming to become the norm, and in a community where cancer and depression and divorce and death affect all of us to varying degrees. My question is, where do you find hope? What gives you hope? I'd like for us to consider the Christmas story tonight from a very different perspective, and as we do so, my hope is that you find hope. Let me ask you, when you think of the Christmas story or the scenes of Christmas, what are the visions that come to mind? What do you think of when you think about Christmas? A lot of things can come to mind, but maybe the Nativity Scene is one of those things that you think about. Maybe you think about Jesus laying peacefully in the manger and Mary standing nearby, looking really amazingly good for a teenager that just had a baby. And Joseph is sitting there, pondering the whole situation, thinking he's now the father of God's son, and the shepherds are gazing on in wide-eyed wonder, and you've got the animals also kind of mingling in the scene. It's a peaceful scene, isn't it? I mean, that's what comes to mind. Even our songs tell us that when Jesus awakes, no crying he makes. It's a peaceful night in which all of creation holds its breath in silent wonder. But is this an accurate picture of what was really happening that night, 2,000 years ago, in Bethlehem? I'd like for us, just for a few minutes, to pull back the veil on the traditional Christmas scene and get a glimpse of Christmas, again, from a different perspective, and it's one that I've never seen on the cover of a Hallmark Christmas card. So if you have been with us at Newday for the last couple of weeks, you know that we have been considering Christmas from the different perspectives of the different authors who wrote down the Christmas stories as they're recorded in the Bible. And we've looked so far at Matthew and we've looked at Luke. And so maybe it would be good to do a little quiz of your Christmas knowledge tonight as we begin. So let's make it multiple choice. We'll make it easy. How about that? I'll give you Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or Harry. You tell me who said what. Who gives us the fact that wise men came to baby Jesus and presented him with gifts? Who would that be? Anybody? If you said Matthew, then that would be right. He's the guy who wrote about that. Which of the Bible authors wrote about angels appearing to shepherds? Who would that be? If you said C, Luke, you would be correct. Now think hard about this one. Which of the Bible authors has a dragon at the center of his Christmas narrative? Harry. No, it's actually John, but good guess. John, who wrote one of the Gospels, actually has a dragon at the center of his birth narrative, but it's not in his Gospel, the Gospel of John. He actually waits until he's 90 years old as a prisoner in exile on the island of Patmos to tell his Christmas narrative in the book of Revelation. And it's in the book of Revelation that we find a very different perspective of the Christmas narrative. It's different from all the others. That doesn't mean the others are wrong. It just gives us a different perspective. John in the book of Revelation kind of pulls back the veil between the natural world and lets us see what was happening in the supernatural world. He pulls back the veil on what was physical, the shepherds and the wise men and all of that, and he lets us see what was happening in the spiritual world. And so in John's narrative, there's no wise men or magi or little drummer boy, but we do have a dragon in John's narrative. John is going to give us a picture of Christmas from heaven's perspective. And in the words of John Eldridge, this is no silent night, this is D-Day. Or Philip Yancey says it like this, he calls it the great invasion, a daring raid by the ruler of the forces of good into universe's seat of evil. So if we think about it, the birth of Jesus, the one who had always been God, as a baby in Bethlehem, was more like a great military invasion or a declaration of war than what we often picture as being a silent night that we sing about in our Christmas songs. More than a tranquil, peaceful event in an unseen world. When Jesus came on the scene, war breaks out. God is advancing to wrestle back creation from the powers of darkness. I mean, this is the birth of Jesus. It's the launch of heaven and an assault on the powers of evil in our world. Just listen to how John describes the event of Jesus' birth in the book of Revelation. It's found in chapter 12 of Revelation, beginning in verse 1. He says it like this. He says, "A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth." So, John introduces us to one of the main characters of the story, a woman. And she's, on the sun, and she's got the moon under her feet, crown of 12 stars, but she's pregnant, very pregnant. She's about to give birth. Without going into all the symbolism that's being talked about here, very clearly, this is a picture of the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. After thousands of years of waiting, the Messiah is about to be born in fulfillment of the prophecy. Now enter the villain. John says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads." John goes on to say, "The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born." So John talks about this dragon, and can you get a picture of who this might be? You don't have to guess, because John tells us in verse 9 exactly who it was, the ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. And so through this symbolism, John is making it clear to us that there is a very real, a very dangerous, a very determined enemy who doesn't only want to lead the whole world astray, but also who wants to destroy God and destroy the child who is born of Mary as soon as he was born. And this is the environment Jesus is born into. Revelation gives us a picture of Satan waiting anxiously for Jesus to be born so that he can kill the child while still a helpless baby. And so Satan works through a Roman ruler named Herod. Herod hears about the birth of Jesus through the visiting wise men who tell them about the birth of this king, and Herod's jealousy is awakened. And he issues a decree and sends soldiers into Bethlehem to kill every child, every male child under the age of 2. Mary and Joseph escape just in time, but that doesn't stop the dragon from continuing to try and destroy Christ. Throughout his life, the dragon is throwing things at Jesus, like storms on the water trying to kill him, or demon-possessed men trying to throw him off of cliffs, or mobs that want to stone him to death. I mean, this is war. Very clearly, this is life and death. This is no heavenly peace. This is spiritual battle for the ultimate control of the world. And Christ is sent as a helpless baby into the midst of it. This is John's perspective of the Christmas story. He continues in verse 5. He says, "She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." And so here he presents Jesus as a ruler, a king. That word for rule in the Greek is actually a word that means to shepherd. He would come to shepherd his people. Like a shepherd shepherds his sheep, he will protect and guide gently, but yet he will have an iron scepter. He has all power and all authority. This gives us a picture of who Jesus was, a gentle shepherd, but one who is also just and firm. And with that said, verse 5 so quickly passes over the entirety of Jesus' life and just goes from his birth directly to the time when he goes back up to heaven in triumph after the cross and after his resurrection. It's as if John is telling us, if you want to know everything that happened in between, I've got another book. It's called The Gospel of John. Read that, but right now let me tell you what happened next in the story. He goes on in verse 7. He says, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he, the dragon, was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down. He was hurled down to the earth, and his angels with him." So John is telling us that there's war in heaven. You got to wonder, well, what does war in heaven look like? Or what are they fighting about? Well, John doesn't directly answer that question. He does give us a hint in one of the next verses. He says that the accuser, he says this about the dragon, he calls him the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night. And so the war in heaven seems to be about accusations that are hurled from the devil to God about you and me. It's as if Satan is accusing our brothers and us before God day and night. He must have been claiming that we still belong to him, that the work Jesus did wasn't sufficient to save the world from sin or to give us eternal life. You can just imagine Satan standing before the throne of God whining, no, you can't have them. They're still mine. Jesus bent the rules. What he did wasn't enough. You can't have them. Whatever the war was about, we know it had something to do with the devil making accusations. But the good news is Satan lost. And he was thrown down out of heaven and hurled down to the earth as the loser in this great battle. There's next, in verse 10, this loud voice from heaven that proclaims victory. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ, for the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. He goes on and he says, those who are saved, those of us who may be saved, they overcame him, the dragon. How? How did they overcome him? By the blood of the Lamb. Yes, Satan eventually did get to Jesus. He did have him nailed to a cross. He took his life, but it's through the cross Jesus gained victory for the entire world. He died our death for us so that we wouldn't have to die. And so they overcame him by the cross, by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. They said, yes, Jesus, we want you to save us. That is the word of their testimony, the word of faith. And he goes on to say, therefore rejoice. Good news! You heavens and you who dwell in them. But woe to who? Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury. Woe to the earth. Good news, bad news. The good news is Satan is lost. The good news is that helpless little baby who invaded Satan's territory that silent night 2,000 years ago grew up and defeated the devil. Satan has been thrown out of heaven forever. But the bad news is that he has been thrown to earth and he is filled with fury. Why is he filled with fury? Well, he's really angry because he wanted to get at God. He wanted to destroy God. He wanted to destroy God's son, but he can't, and now he never can. And so now all he has left to him is to destroy those or go after and harass God's people. He could try to make the lives of those of us living on this planet hell on earth, and at times he succeeds. That's what we see when we hear the news of another mass shooting or another suicide bomber, or when one of us is diagnosed with cancer or one of us loses a loved one. This is why the voice in heaven says, woe to you. But here's the real reason the devil is filled with fury, and here's where we find hope tonight. The devil, he is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. Think about that. Just let that sink in. He knows his time is short. The devil, the one who wants nothing more than to destroy you, to destroy those who you love, knows his time is short. And what that means is, while the devil may make our lives difficult, while he may make our world chaotic for a time, his time is short. His time is running out. This means that because Jesus was born as a helpless baby in the town of Bethlehem, a time is coming when the devil will be no more, and crying will be no more, and death and sorrow will be no more. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. You know, it was just a few weeks ago. It was after the last shootings in San Bernardino. I found myself just really depressed. I was sad. I was just kind of wearing this sadness like a cloak for several days. And I felt, just because of looking at what was happening in our world and in our country, I felt like hope was draining from my heart. But that's when God spoke to me through the words and the story of A Christmas Carol. In 1864, one of America's great poets, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote the poem that became the well-known Christmas Carol, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. This is what he wrote. He said, I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Beautiful song. It starts so positive, but then Longfellow all of a sudden turns to despair. In the very next verse, he goes on to write, and in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And I had to wonder, why does he write of despair and hate in a Christmas song? And the question is clearly answered as you look at what was happening in Longfellow's life and in our country in 1864 when he was writing this. Just 2 years before, he had lost his beloved wife in a senseless house fire. And more than that, as he writes this, our country was being torn apart by the terrors and horror of the Civil War. And Longfellow had just received word that his son, his only son, had been badly wounded in a battle in the Civil War. And he had just received this news as he's writing this poem that became our Christmas carol. And as he, after working through several verses of expressing his despair in the conditions of the world and the war that was tearing our country apart, he finally comes back to what he knows. He comes back to what Christmas tells him. And he ends the song like this. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. How can the birth of a child born 2,000 years ago bring hope to a world where 12 million Syrian refugees are living in horrendous condition, or where Islamic radicals behead and kill and blow up innocent people? How can the birth of a child 2,000 years ago make a difference in a country where people are increasingly becoming afraid to fly or going to public places because they're afraid of someone with a bomb or a gun who wants to take their life? God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. And this is all because of the victory won by that baby who invaded our world 2,000 years ago. It's because he lived a perfect life in my place. It's because he died a death he didn't deserve. And by doing so, he took the sting of death that was intended for me. It is the same Jesus who John records in the book Gospel of John, who looked at his disciples the night before he died and saw the hopelessness in their faces, and he said to them, don't be discouraged. Believe in God. Believe also in me. I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I'll come back, and I'll take you to be there with me. John tells us of a new heaven and a new earth that Jesus is preparing, that he'll soon return and take us to, a world where there'll be no more shootings or bombings or refugees or hunger or depression or cancer or death. A world where God will wipe every tear from our eyes, for the old order of things has passed away. All of this is made possible because of Christmas. Because of Christmas, evil has been defeated. Because of Christmas, the devil knows that his time is short. Because of Christmas, we have something to hope for because we know how the story ends. And it is a good ending for those who will simply put their faith in this God who would come as a baby born in Bethlehem on that night, that silent night, 2,000 years ago. And so now you really know what was happening that night, that silent night. Would you just bow your heads with me? And before we get to the celebration of this day with the meals and the laughter and the games and the gifts, let's just enjoy a moment of silence.